To the Forum on Autonomous Listening. I'm going to be kicking things off today. I'm Kirsten Okubo, and with me are my colleagues Josefina Santana and Analia Duarte. So they'll be presenting in succession after me. We are part of this forum. We're all talking about listening. We're going to be presenting one after the other and saving the Q&A for the very end. So our format today is to move through all three presentations, and at the end, you can direct your questions to any one of us. So please hold your questions till the end. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to be talking to you today about academic listening circles and developing autonomous listening. And I'm going to be covering these four areas. I'm going to talk really quickly about what autonomous listening is. Then I'll be introducing academic listening circles. What are they? How do I actually conduct them in the classroom? I'll be talking about the roles and the procedure, as well as looking at some outcomes and some possible further activities and assessments. All right. First of all, in order to talk about autonomous listening, I want to talk about what our students have to contend with to become autonomous listeners. And of course, we all know that there's a range of obstacles for students in listening. We know that there's a whole plethora of things that make listening difficult. But this morning, I want to touch briefly on these three. Firstly, short-term memory. This is something that we all employ when we're listening. However, in your native language or in your proficient languages, you're able to employ a short-term memory that is actually a fair bit longer than when you're doing this in a language that you're learning. So this means our students' short-term memory is considerably shorter than, say, ours in English. Or I like to flip it onto the students with their native language. They're able to hold an utterance in their native language in their mind for a lot longer than they can an English utterance. So they have less time. They have, a matter of seconds of memory of what they've heard. And this means that for a longer utterance, by the time you get to the end of it, they've already forgotten the beginning of it. So they can't make connections between what they've heard and what they're hearing now, right? So connecting information is very difficult. Secondly, this mental map, which is basically an understanding of the system of language in terms of grammar and vocabulary, how it all fits together, which means that if you're listening and you miss something, you miss a few words, if it's your native language or a proficient language, you can fill that in automatically. You don't even have to think about it, right? For example, if I were to say, if blah, 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 blah dinner, then you blah, 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 blah dessert, right? And you can fill that in pretty easily and go, okay, if you don't eat your dinner, you won't get dessert. And that's natural, it's automatic for us. But for our students, they're struggling with all those unheard words, and it's just a puzzle for them. So the lack of, or the underdeveloped mental map trips them up as they're trying to fill in blanks for words that they didn't hear. Thirdly, cultural expectations. You all know that these are a huge obstacle for our students, right? When they're listening to a speaker who assumes that the audience is going to have certain cultural background knowledge, our students get terribly tripped up with these. It causes them to hesitate, to lose the train of thought, and it's very difficult for them to get back into it. Going back to my previous example, the whole dinner-dessert thing, right? If they heard, if you don't eat your dinner, you won't get dessert, they don't really necessarily understand the connection between dinner and dessert, perhaps, depending on where they've come from, right? Another example, a professor might refer to the fact that, Jack and Jill were at the altar, but Jack forgot the ring. And students who aren't from, a sort of a Western environment where you actually have weddings at an altar are not going to get that cultural reference. Instances where an audience will all laugh at something, right? Students can't understand why everyone's laughing, and they feel like they need to know, and they just get tripped up and they stop, right? So these are some of the obstacles to listening. There are many more. I'm not going to go into much more detail. But this is what our students are contending with when we're trying to move them towards autonomous listening. So, real quick, what exactly is autonomous listening? Well, it's that automaticity, that ability to listen in English as if you're listening in your native language, where you're not really even thinking about it. It's just an automatic process. And ultimately, that's what we want our students to be able to do so that they can go off into their contexts and be able to listen without the scaffolding that we might give them or without the support that we give them in the classroom. Okay, so academic listening circles, what are they and how do they help students move towards autonomous listening? Well, essentially, these academic listening circles are both an individual and a group activity that students do where they pay attention to a particular listening text with the goal of understanding it very deeply and with the goal of understanding it from specific points of view in terms of trying to overcome these obstacles, things like understanding connections between old and new information or these cultural expectations. They're going to explicitly pay attention to these things in order to more efficiently, implicitly do this as autonomous listeners in the future. I also want to point out that they're modelled after academic reading circles, which were developed by Tyson Seaburn, who many of you probably know. All right, so what exactly is an academic listening circle? Well, basically, I take students into groups of 4, right? So I divide students into a group of 4, and each student gets one role. These roles are leader, discourser, analyzer, and exemplifier. And each student does one role per academic listening circle, so they only have the one focus. The leader, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? They're going to lead the circle and kind of run the show. They focus on more macro-level main ideas. They're going to be the ones who determine what the key ideas of that particular talk are, and they're going to move the discussion along. Discourser, this person is going to focus on discourse, right? Systemic referential discourse, connecting information both within a certain section of the talk or forward or backward within the talk. Third role is analyzer. This person is going to focus on unknown vocabulary to a certain extent, but we don't want to get hung up on, a multitude of words. But they are also going to be focusing on that cultural or background knowledge that the speaker expects of the audience. And lastly, the exemplifier. The exemplifier is going to focus on examples and what those examples are examples of, right? The ideas that they're connected to. And whether they're simple or extended examples. Are they anecdotal or are they evidence-driven? And what exactly what idea are they supporting? All right, so what I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to hand out something real quick. Oops. Make sure I've got it. Can you actually help me with this? Just hand those out. For each. Yeah, one for everyone. I'm going to play a short section of a talk, and this is quite difficult to... Where'd it go? Sorry. This is quite difficult to read, so I'm going to hand it out in person here. And I'll just pull up the talk. So I'll just press play. I don't need to do it just yet. Oh, that one. Okay. Thank you. And then press spacebar. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to play a short section of a talk. And as you listen, I'd like you to look along on the transcript and determine what areas students might focus on if they are paying attention to referential or systemic discourse markers. What areas might students pay attention to if they are focusing on cultural background knowledge? And what areas might they focus on if they're paying attention to examples, right? And examples and main ideas. So you might be underlining or highlighting or circling or any indication of those things as you follow along. Okay, here we go.
Curatorial staffing is female. Now, you might be wondering, actually, what is a museum curator? Well, curators are basically in-house scholars and storytellers for museums. Through their exhibitions and gallery displays and their lectures and books, curators tell stories about human creativity, ingenuity, and history. Now, I recall over the last sort of several decades of working in an art museum, I've noticed that also, happily, because many institutions value curatorial scholarship and expertise, curators also serve as the kind of pipeline to leadership. So I suppose you might be thinking that if 70% of curators are women in most art museums, and also curators are the kind of training ground for leadership, I bet you're assuming that there's a lot of women leading art museums in the world. But in fact, that is not the case. I also remember as a student watching the roil of art world feminist protests that burst into the headlines, led by groups like the Guerrilla Girls, who asked the provocative question in their 1989 poster, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? The group campaigned, and actually still does, against the scarcity of women artists in museums. And their protest still applies, not just to artists, but also to arts world leadership. A woman has never run a top 3 art museum, and according to attendance figures, those are the Louvre in Paris, London's British Museum, and New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Altogether, these 3 have been running for about 630 years, and not a single female director in sight. If you look at the top 20 museums in the world ranked by attendance, you can see that there are 3 female directors, but that's just 3 women leading the top 20 group of institutions where 70% of their curatorial staff are women, and that staff also is the training ground for leadership. Now, if you think about
Okay, so there was our little listening activity. What I'm going to do now is just look at each of the individual roles that students would play in the listening circles and what they would be focusing on for this particular section. Right, we'll start with the analyzer. In this text, right, the analyzer is focusing on cultural background knowledge or perhaps vocabulary that might trip them up. Is there anything you might suggest that they focus on here? Sorry? Curator, yeah. However, note that this was in the middle of the talk, so perhaps curator was mentioned prior to this section. But yeah, that would be something they'd focus on. Probably it came up earlier because it's kind of the topic of the talk. Anything else? Yeah, Guerrilla Girls, right? That's a huge one. We've probably all heard of Guerrilla Girls, right, from the 80s and the 90s, but the students aren't going to know who they are. And all these names of the museums, although they were listed up there in the slides, so that was a little bit helpful. Yeah, right, so the analyzer is going to focus on these things. Sorry, it's a little fuzzy. They're going to focus on things like Royal of Art World, the Guerrilla Girls, the Met Museum. Words like pipeline or provocative might come up in this section of the talk as well. If the student is really keen, they may notice that pipeline to leadership has been paraphrased nicely here, defined as training ground in leadership. So they may actually find it defined right there in the text. So the analyzer for this section of the talk will focus on that background cultural knowledge. They're going to research it. They're going to Google Gorilla Girls. They're going to Google the Met Museum and find out what these things are. And then they're going to bring that information to the class for the listening circle. Okay, next is discourser. What areas of the talk, of this part of the talk, is the discourser going to focus on? What's that? The connection. So, I mean, there's quite a few in here, but in particular, we'd want to focus on these ones, right? The ones that actually link two parts of a sentence or an utterance together, particularly, but in fact, that is not the case. That's actually a really important part of the talk here. They have to understand the contrast, and also, in fact, that is not the case. What's that? So that's a referential discourse that they're going to have to figure out what that whole utterance means based on that is not the case. Further down, the group, their protest, these three, these are some more sort of referential discourse markers that would help them to follow the talk. So the discourse is going to focus on these, bring this to the listening circle and share it with their group. Exemplifier. What's the exemplifier going to focus on here? The examples, there's a couple of them, yeah? So we've got, first of all, it's a little bit of an anecdotal sort of anecdotal reference because she's talking about her own memory, but she is referring to something that happened. We've also got this statistic down here, top 20 museums, 70% of the curatorial staff. So some evidence there, some examples that provide evidence for ideas. So the exemplifier is going to bring those examples and explain what they're examples of, right? The idea that these examples are connected to, and share those with the circle. Now, and the leader, of course, the leader is going to be focusing on that main idea. So the exemplifier and the leader will often kind of tag team off of each other. But the leader is basically going to summarize the idea that is given here. I'm going to just move up here. This idea that women are not making it to the top of leadership positions in the art world. Basically, that's going to be the key idea of this part of the talk. And so when the group is forming and they're in their little group of four, they're going to be talking about each section of the text. They're going to move through it just like that. And then afterwards, they'll move on to the next section, do the same thing. So they prepare this all for homework on their own, individually, and then they come to class and they talk together and move through each section of the talk. That's kind of how this works. So in the end, if they do this successfully, they're paying explicit attention to the things that are going to trip them up as they're trying to move towards autonomous listening. They're building their ability to contextualize what they're hearing. They're building their ability to follow these discourse markers, to negotiate unknown cultural knowledge, right? And in the end, hopefully they'll have a really deep understanding of this text, this particular text, and ultimately we want them to be able to use that text in their context. In an academic context, they might need to refer to that text in a presentation, a talk, a seminar. They might need to cite it if they're writing something. And if they're able to recall ideas from this talk, that will be evidence for whatever ideas they're putting forward. All right, I want to just point out that I've got a quick link. It is on the back of the handout. This will be on the IATEFL conference website as well. But this link will take you to supporting documents. These are documents that I give my students in preparation for and post-listening circle as well. There are several things you can have students do after the listening circle as a way to sort of follow up. You could give them a comprehension quiz. I have them do collaborative notes where they kind of answer some questions and summarize the talk. You could have them do a number of things, but there are some documents up here for you to have a look at. Okay? Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now. Thank you.
Can everybody hear? My name is Josefina Santana. I'm better known as Dixie. And I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague, Enrique Barba, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. This is based on work that we've done together. And so I need to give him all the credit for this. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about teaching metacognitive strategies to improve students' learning skills and how this leads very much to autonomous listening. So I'm going to be talking about what is metacognition, how it helps learners, and I'm going to be telling you about some kind of metacognitive listening activities. When I sent the proposal, I had sent it as a workshop. And later it was incorporated into this forum, so it had to be in a shorter version. So I'm not going to be able to do the activities with you, but please take note of my email. I think I have it on the presentation. And if you're interested in getting these materials or working with them, just let me know. And of course, you can have it. So what is metacognition? It's been defined as thinking about one's learning. And it's like knowing how you learn better, knowing you yourself, what kind of learner you are, and how you can learn more effectively. And this is divided into 3 stages or 3 areas, which is planning your learning, monitoring your learning, and evaluating. The work that my colleague and I did was based very much on the work of Vandergrift and Go and the studies they've been doing into metacognition and listening. And they tell us that metacognitive knowledge is divided into person knowledge. I know myself. I know what I can do, and I know what I'm not yet able to do and what I need to work on. I have knowledge of the task. I know what I need to do to accomplish this particular task that I'm being asked to do at the moment. And knowledge of strategies. I know what tools to use to accomplish the task that I need to do. So how does it help learners? Well, having a battery of metacognitive learning strategies is useful because it allows learners to evaluate what they're doing. And it helps them know if what they're doing is working or it's not working, if they need to go back, if they need to change their strategies. And it also helps them organize their learning. It helps them plan for the future. It helps them establish goals of what they want to accomplish in their learning. Okay. So how does this work? All right, imagine, you don't have to imagine because I'm going to tell you, but my students, yes. Okay, so my students, I work at a university, and my students are required to take an English language proficiency test in order to graduate. This is a requirement. They can't graduate if they don't have this English language proficiency test. It can be any one of the standardized tests. It can be the IELTS, it can be the BULATS, it can be the TOEFL or the TOEIC, any one of those standardized tests. And they need to have this by the time they finish their studies. So a student knows that he has to do this, and let's say that a student has strong metacognitive skills. Then the student will say, okay, so I need to take this exam. What am I going to do? I'm going to learn about the exam. I'm going to find out what it consists of. I need to find out if I am ready to do it or not. So a metacognitive student will look at these things, will look at the exam, will begin to say, okay, I'm strong on listening, but I need to work on reading, or I need to work on grammar, or whatever it is. And then he or she will plan for this. I'm going to take classes, or beginning in the semester, or I'm going to take advantage of my summer and I'm going to go abroad. Okay? So this is the idea of metacognitive skills. Now, some people have these skills already. We usually acquire them as children. We acquire them through our parents or through our teachers. When our parents or our teachers say, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? What is it that you need to accomplish with this? What are you going to do here? How did you do it? How did it work? Did it work or didn't it work? What are you going to do next time? This kind of questioning that our parents or our teachers help us with when we're doing our homework, for example, or when we're in class, these are the ones that develop metacognitive learning skills. And these are very, very useful. If I have these skills, then I can take control of my learning, and I can become metacognitive. I can become autonomous. The learning doesn't depend only on what the teacher is providing. The learning depends on myself and what I set out to do. Now, unfortunately, we don't all have this experience. We don't all have these magnificent parents or magnificent teachers. So the good news is that we can learn it later in life. all right? So even if your students haven't acquired these skills yet, you can help them to acquire them. That's the good news, okay? Okay, so planning for, so Vandergriff and Go apply all of this metacognitive planning and monitoring and evaluating to listening. So in planning for the listening skills, what the students need to do is they need to bring into consciousness what they already know about the topic, all right? And we do this a lot through pre-questions, right? What do you know about the topic? What is the topic? What vocabulary do you think you're going to know, to hear here? They need to analyze the genre. They need to say, okay, is this an academic listening? Is this an advertisement? Is this a lecture? Is this a TED Talk like we saw right now? Is this, what kind of listening is this? And with that knowledge, they know how this text is organized, and that helps them understand better. And then they need to anticipate the words or ideas that they're going to hear. They need to predict. They need to determine where they're going to pay attention. For example, in a text as dense as the one that Kirsten presented to us, they can't pay attention to everything. So this is why Kirsten's model is very, very effective, because they're focusing on one thing. They're focusing on the discourse, or they're focusing on the connectors, or they're focusing on the vocabulary that they don't know and they think is important. So this helps them focus their attention, and even if they need to listen several times, at least they're learning how to do this. They need to predict what they will hear, and they need to clear their mind of distractions, and they need to have strategies for this, okay? What am I going to do when I start to become distracted? What am I going to do when I stop paying attention? And you teach them things like take notes or jot down the main ideas, and these things help keep them focused. Okay, and then we have monitoring comprehension. Okay, so they need to be, as they're listening, they need to be evaluating. Am I understanding what's going on? What can I do to understand better? Do I need to stop the listening? Do I need to start it again? What is it that I need to do? They need to check for consistency with their predictions. And as I was preparing this, I was remembering, it's an anecdote that somebody told me once. This was told to me by this young man named Andrew, and he was Canadian, and he was from Regina. Is that how you say it? Regina in Canada. Okay. Is anybody from there? Oh, okay, right. Well, this is a story. Is your name Andrew? No. All right. So Andrew was driving one day to Thunder Bay. So he's driving. I don't know how far it is from Regina to Thunder Bay. I don't know if it's a lot. It's a ways? Okay. So he's been driving for a while, and he decides to stop on the road too, and he decides to get something to eat. So he stops, he gets something to eat, and as he's leaving the restaurant, there's a young lady who's mopping up the restaurant. And she turns and she says, "Have a nice day." But he didn't understand that. What he understood was, "Haven't I seen you?" So imagine the conversation. "Have a nice day." And he looks at her and he says, "No, I don't think so." And she says, "Oh, why not?" And he says, "Well, I'm from Regina." And she says, "Okay." And he says, "It's a long way." And she says, "Is it that bad?" And at that point, he realizes that something's going on. And he says, "What did you ask me?" So they had a good laugh, and that was the end of the story. But you see how this monitoring comes in, right? So you're having the conversation, and suddenly, stop, right? Something's going on here, and that's when you stop, okay? So we do this naturally in our own language. It's perfectly acceptable to make mistakes or to mishear, right? But the thing is that as language learners, you need to realize that this is perfectly normal, and you need to be able to stop and say, "Wait a minute, what's going on here? Let's start again," okay? So this is an example of monitoring. Okay, and then they need to know, really important, it's not necessary to understand every single word. It's not necessary. You can get the gist. You can get the main idea. You can understand what's going on, even if you don't understand every single word. And this idea was brought home to me very much yesterday as I was taking the tour of the city of Liverpool, and I had a guide with a very lovely Liverpudlian accent. Yeah, you know what I mean. So it was, I think that was funny, okay. All right, but I got the main idea. I saw that it was a lovely city. I saw that it was very much a Beatles city. Okay, so students need to verify their progress in comprehension, all right? They need to make sure, they need to have some kind of guideline to know that they're understanding. And usually we do this in the form of comprehension questions. And they need to determine whether their approach is working or not. Are the strategies that I'm putting into play working, or are they not working? And this is something that I've noticed that my students don't have, and I really need to work on them. So I ask them, how are you preparing for the exam? How are you preparing for the TOEFL or the TOEIC or the IELTS? And they say, oh, I watch TV in English. And you say, uh-huh. Have you noticed what kind of problems you're having? Yeah, the grammar is really hard for me. That's why I haven't been able to pass the exam. So what are you doing? I'm watching TV in English. Okay, so we need to say, all right, this strategy is not working. Let's look for a different strategy. Okay, and then we need, the last stage, remember, was evaluating. And evaluating is divided into two parts. And the first part is solving problems. Am I understanding or am I not understanding? If I am understanding, great, let's go. If I'm not understanding, then I need to look for a different strategy. I need to do something different. And then we take what we understand and we make deductions about what we didn't understand. We make inferences. So this is another skill that we need to have. And if possible, we ask for clarification, like Andrew, right? What did you ask me? All right, so we ask for clarification if the context allows. Okay, so you'll notice that a lot of these are listening strategies for listening in real life, and maybe not so much in the context that we're working on. For example, if you're in the TOEFL exam, you can't say, I didn't understand that. Can you stop that and rewind? It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. But if we're working with these strategies in class, we're improving listening comprehension, and then when they face that kind of situation, then they'll have better skills to face it with. Okay, any questions so far? Are we okay? Yeah? Okay, so the students need to reflect on what happened, what went wrong, and why it went wrong, and of course, what they can do to change it. They confirm their comprehension, and they can do this through comprehension questions or with a transcript of the text. And they reflect on their success. Did my strategies work? Yes or no? So these are the ideas that Van der Griff and Go propose. So what my colleague and I did was we applied this in our classes. We took 6 groups of students with 3 different teachers. The groups of students, they were all at the B1 level, and they all had between 18 and 24 students. So in total, it was 64 students, something like this, in this experiment. We divided them. Each teacher had 1 control group and 1 experimental group. So, so we tried to control a little bit for the teacher effect here. All the students were at the B1 level, and we used a listening activities book. It's the North Star book. I have the reference at the end. It's North Star 2, and it's at the B2 level. So we were looking for activities that were a little bit more difficult than they could actually handle, because we wanted to see if the metacognitive strategies were working. If the listenings were too easy, there's no point in applying strategies. So we were looking for something a little bit more difficult than they could actually do. Okay, and so we put all of these activities on Moodle. Now, we know that you know, giving students listening practice, and we know that teaching strategies works. There's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of studies into this. But we usually, if you look at those studies, you see that there's a lot of working together to kind of create this situation. Well, let me explain. So for example, the teacher says, okay, we're going to do a listening about Liverpool. What do you know about the topic? What vocabulary are you going to find? And we do this as a group, and we do the brainstorming, all right? And we wanted to know if we could do it without the group. If you have a good teacher and if you have a good group, it's going to work. We wanted to see what happens if you're working on your own. Is it going to be successful or not? So we uploaded all of the activities to Moodle. We took the listenings from the book and we uploaded them to Moodle. We took the questions from the book and we uploaded them to Moodle. So that the students could work autonomously. They did some in-class work together with their teachers, but then once a week, this is during a semester, and the semester is 16 weeks long, once a week we told the students, okay, we're going to do a listening activity, you're going to be working on your own, and it was between 20 and 30 minutes, depending on the listening, and so the students had to do the pre-questions, the listening, the post-questions, and they could take their time on it. It was 30 minutes. If they whizzed through it, that was fine. If they had to do it several times, that was fine. They had that time to do it on their own. Okay, so the listening and the activities as is from the book were added to the Moodle. And we added, for the experimental groups only, a series of pre- and post-listening questions that I'm going to show you in a minute. And we gave time for the students to work independently, and what did we find? At the end of the semester, we found that everybody improved. We did a listening test at the beginning, we did a listening test, the same listening test at the end, it's a listening diagnostic test, and we discovered that everybody improved, all right? But we discovered that the students who were the weakest at the beginning, the ones who were even below the B1 level, they were the ones that improved dramatically. So everybody went up, but the weaker students went up dramatically. If you're interested in the statistics, I can send you all of that information as well. Okay, so what is this? This is from the book itself, and this is Unit 2, I think, of Book 2. The title of the unit is Where Does Time Go? And this is the typical questions that they have. Look at the photo. What is the listening going to be about? They're talking about challenges. What challenges do you face? This is the typical material that we find in a listening book. And some of it is metacognitive. When you ask them to prepare and to predict, it is. But some of it is not, especially the post-listening. So what we did was we asked, questions like this. In the next talk, the speaker speaks very fast. What can you do to understand better? That's a pre-question. And then the post-questions. Was it easy to maintain concentration? What did you do to help yourself concentrate? Another post question. How easy or difficult was it to understand the talk? What made it easier or more difficult for you? Look at the title. Listen for 30 seconds and stop. What difficulties do you think you will find? What will you do to understand better? Another. What is the title of the talk? What strategies will you use to understand? And then a post question. Were your strategies successful? And then another post question. Did you understand all the words? Did you understand the principal information? Is it necessary to understand all the words? Why or why not? Okay, so we added this kind of questions. That was the only change that we made in those commercial listening books. We added this kind of questions that promote strategic listening. And we were very, very successful. As you see, our weaker students improved dramatically. Everybody was able to go up. The stronger students went up on average 100 points on the listening test, but the weaker students went up as much as 300 points. 300 points on that listening test. So it made the difference from an A2 to a B2, for example. All right, so what we found is that this kind of, adding this kind of questions, adding questions where students have to think about what they're doing, this is really useful. If you're interested in doing something like this, at the beginning we had eliminated the comprehension questions that come with the text, and we left just this so that they wouldn't have so many questions. But then we found two things. One, that the students couldn't really gauge if they had done well or not because they had no comprehension questions to measure against. And secondly, we found that they thought it was kind of goofy. They said, where are the comprehension questions? What's wrong? Why are you only asking me how I feel or what I did, or why don't you ask me if I understood? So to avoid this kind of situation, we added the comprehension questions, which made the exercise a little bit longer, but that the students found very valuable. All right? So if you have any questions, we'll leave it for the Q&A, and I will go over to Analia.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Good morning. So I will be presenting on the abracadabra of listening. It's a different perspective from the two perspectives my colleagues presented on. Exactly 6 years ago, at this very time, I was here in Machu Picchu. It's the most representative icon of the Inca civilization. And very interestingly for us, language and communication professionals, 40,000 Incas governed a territory with 10 million subjects speaking over 30 different languages. So Quechua was for them what English is for us today. And the reason why I'm bringing this here is because it makes a wonderful analogy with my context of work. My learners are adults who work in multinational companies, most of them, where they need to do their jobs in English, which means that in my context, to know English means to know how to do in English. It's knowledge as a capacity for action. They manage across cultures, and they must overcome 4 different barriers. Different communication styles, direct or indirect, trouble with accents and fluency, which unfortunately today still influence perceptions of competence and of status in multinational companies, differing attitudes towards hierarchy and authority, and conflicting norms of decision-making. It seems that even though most of my learners, the ones I will be sharing, the ones I have selected for this presentation are C1 and C2, and the ones I use the approach to listening I will be sharing with you today, they are very high-level learners, C1 and C2, but they still have communication problems, even though they can decode successfully. So it seems like the Tower of Babel syndrome affects some of them many times. And this takes me to this reflection of understanding and always bearing in mind that even seemingly universal and explicit knowledge, such as mathematics, is open to interpretation. And interpretation is a key word here. So the first step before moving on to interpreting text is working on decoding, which is an essential prerequisite for understanding a speaker's meaning, as Richard Caldwell says in this gem, which I strongly recommend everyone to work on before doing anything else in terms of listening development. We must remember that listening seems to be a very much online activity, with the listener decoding the sounds of speech at a delay behind a speaker of as little as a quarter of a second, which means that we as teachers must intervene in order to make learners move on to interpretation and go well beyond understanding simple words. Comprehension questions. The Inca civilization did something that is a kind of a lesson for business English learners, and because they faced a challenge which these people mastered so well. They had a spectacular adaptation to, let me read from here so as not to turn around, spectacular adaptation to natural landscapes, and they managed integration very well. They did not destroy and replace the cultures they conquered. An Inca deity was added to, not substituted for, local gods. Locally important people continued to be important. And this is the situation of the global workplace today, where the world seems to be going in the direction of integration. It's inviting business English learners to abandon the polarized dichotomy of adaptation, like we're all the same, or differentiation, let's celebrate differences, but rather it's inviting us to, do you want me to change this? Huh? So where was I? Integration. So the world is going in the direction of integrating, of glocalizing, blending globalization and localization. And this is something that the Inca culture did very well. So, as the Liverpudlian Beatles song says, I am he, as you are me, and we are all together. This means that any organization, be it a multinational company or any of the schools we work for, works or interacts in 3 different dimensions. It is the personal I, the interpersonal we, and the impersonal it. So it's me, my relationships with others, and what we do together to achieve results. But the thing is that to achieve results in the it dimension, this one, the interpersonal, is essential. Which means that business English trainers must train learners in relational language use, because they are the ones who talk their companies into being. With no talking, there is no company. And today, most of that talking in multinational companies is done in English, because it's the lingua franca, okay? So we are forced to work on the relational dimension of spoken business communication in ELF. Because in business, and I would say in life, R equals R. Results equal relationships. So to achieve results in the it dimension, we need to interpret. If there is no interpretation of the we dimension, there are no results in the it dimension. The irony of all this, as we become increasingly digital, if we want to design our future, is that we need to do something that is intensely human and that we can only do for each other, person to person. Listen. Now, the bad news is that listening is not a natural capability just as hearing is. But there is good news too. The good news, is that it is skill. And skills can be trained and they can be improved. But the very first step in order to improve our business English learners' listening, mind you, this applies to any kind of setting. I'm talking about business because this is my setting. The very first step is to raise awareness, because without awareness, no change is possible. In fact, the current view says that listening is conscious awareness. It is what organizes and correlates our relationships with ourselves, our circumstances, time, and whatever is beyond our comprehension, as the giant transformational leadership expert Jim Selman says. This means that it's very important for business English teachers to move from linguistic listening to pragmatic listening, because learners can benefit from a targeted focus on pragmatic comprehension. The learner receives input, okay? A speech signal, pairs the speech signal with a word. The next step is pairing the words with a meaning. But decoding does not end there. What happens next is that the learner imposes a grammatical pattern on that input, okay? And at the sentence level, exactly the same thing happens. The learner perceives the bare meaning of a sentence and then uses contextual information, word knowledge, to decide on the relevance of that within the context of conversation. So this is the reason why we need to train them on going beyond the initial meaning of words into interpreting what the intended meaning was. And this is pragmatics. Now my challenge is to make learners take ownership of the C1, C2 learners, remember, is to make them take ownership of their listening problems, because in fact they are decoding successfully. In a traditional language class they will pass off as excellent listeners, but in fact sometimes they are not. So the way in which I need them to take ownership is by realizing their own blind spots. And what I do is I use this metaphor, which doesn't come from ELT, but it comes from organizational psychology, which is Heifetz's metaphor of balcony dance floor principle. This is inviting them to go to the balcony, like above the dance floor, to see what is really happening and detect their own communication breakdowns. So the idea is that from these vantage points, they are more able to detect their own blind spots. So rather than looking through their conversations, through their own ethnocentric lens, I invite them to look at their conversations. For example, by recording their call conferences, which allows us to go back and look into where the problems occurred. The intention behind that is that they detect their blind spots, but at the same time, I work a lot on making them understand, because remember they are very high-level learners, on making them understand that listening is not the same as hearing. And that when they listen, they have to listen to what is said, but also to what is not said. So to exemplify that, let me show you the beginning of, this is a comic illustration, which shows very clearly that listening is not the same as hearing. Can you help me to play it?
You know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't!
Try to...
See that listening is not the same as hearing. So, if it's not about the nail, what is it about? Before we meet, before anyone speaks, even before we think, we are already listening. And we're always navigating in the context that listening provides. So we can say that listening is making meaning from sound. Interestingly enough, by the time I was preparing this talk, have you heard of Julian Treasure, the TED speaker? Well, his TED talk on powerful speaking, by the time I prepared to come to Liverpool, had been watched 33 million times. Whereas from 2013, whereas his talk on conscious listening had only been watched 7 million times. Interesting. We seem to prefer sending over receiving, and that's a very serious problem we get into. And when it comes to teaching, things are equally worrying, because traditionally in classes, listening has been the sleeping partner in the business of oral communication. Now, who wants to make of your learners better speakers? everyone, absolutely. Let me tell you that there is abundant research showing that proficiency in speaking correlates very, very, very closely to proficiency in listening. And if you want to have better speakers, what we need to do is to put the cart of listening well before the cart of speaking. And this cart of listening, this horse of listening, is a very active and a very energetic horse, because listening is anything but passive. It's a very active, very complex skill, and a powerful one, because the quality of our life will be affected by the quality of our listening. We must help our learners improve their listening proficiency to process oral inputs and engage effectively in oral interactions. We are talking about interacting with others, the interpersonal dimension. Let me bring in here a very useful distinction, which is an oldie but a very good one. Already in 1978, Widdowson established this difference between seeing language as usage and seeing language as use. Whereas the first one talks about seeing language as the signification of a sentence, the second one understands language as acts of communication, meaning when we are using language, we are generating realities. We are doing something with our saying. Whereas the first one is hearing, the second one belongs to listening. So I invite you to reflect on what of the two approaches you're approaching, if you forgive the redundancy, in your listening classes. Are you treating language as usage, or are you seeing it as use? Food for thought. Let me show you this real dialogue between an Indian and a Westerner. So one says, Ashok, how's that data analysis going? Not too bad. Will you be ready for the meeting? The meeting? Right. When is that scheduled for again? Friday. You guys will be ready, right? Actually, I wanted to ask you about the meeting. Who is going to be there exactly? Well, my team, Sharon's team, and probably Eric's people. I see. Should be very interesting. This is a real conversation. So if Carl assumes that he has listened simply because he can repeat word for word what Ashok has said, he will be utterly wrong. Because to listen, hearing is not enough. To listen, we need to interpret. So we can redefine listening as perceiving plus interpreting. Mind you, I didn't put here hearing. I put perceiving. Why? Any idea? Because listening is a whole body activity, which is wonderfully represented in the Chinese character for listening, which reads, I give you my ears, my eyes, my undivided attention, and my heart. To listen, we use much more than our ears. Every human has their own individual listening, shaped by their personal set of filters. Over time, that listening tends to ossify, mind the word, into a default listening position. And this is something every human being suffers from. The problem is that this is invisible. We are not aware of this. Filters color our interpretations of what is said or not said and inform the meanings we give to certain circumstances and behaviors. In other words, we are always already listening. Let me add, before listening. Before you really listen, you are already listening. Do you get my point? This is called, technically, the already listening structure of interpretation. And it's very important to work on this with all our learners. The filters are culture, language of course, values, attitudes, beliefs, intentions, expectations, and emotions. So there are certain tools that we can bring into the classroom in order to make this invisible, ossified structure visible. The first one of which is verifying listening. As simple as checking understanding. With lower level learners, I teach them the lexical chunk. Let me check if I understood correctly. Did you mean that? Da, 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 da. So with higher level learners, like C1 and C2, this is not necessary, but the skill of verifying listening is something that needs to be trained because they assume they have understood. But it also means that we as listeners need to become suspicious of our interpretation, and verifying the listening with the speaker is also something that fine-tunes our own listening. Second one is sharing concerns. In the listening process, this is very important because sometimes we hear okay, we understand what the person is saying, but we have no idea of why the person is telling us that. Sometimes, in the context of discourse, this is obvious or explicit when the person says, given that, da 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 da, but sometimes it's not. So unveiling the concern is also a tool for fine-tuning listening. The second one is inquiring, and this seems contradictory because this is a tool we use. We talk more to listen better, but contradictory as it sounds, it helps to fine-tune our listening because we can check, we can correct, we can expand on what we heard. In other words, when the person is saying something to us, when she is saying something, what is she doing? Is she committing to something? Is she describing factually, or is she just giving an opinion? Sometimes we collapse opinions and judgments. Is she committing to doing any action? In other words, when she says what she's saying, what is she doing? This is seeing language as actions. As action. Do you remember speech act theory? This is the theory at its best. Then raising awareness about our already listening structure. Remembering all the time that this is invisible helps us work more tangibly on this invisible ossified structure we all have. Then doing rasa listening. Rasa means being in full receive mode, appreciating, and this means giving auditory or visual cues to the speaker. Summarizing with these simple but very powerful words, so training learners on intervening with the so words helps them train their listening. And finally, ask relevant questions, most especially at the end. Listening to bodies and emotions. This is very important because teachers tend to forget that we are not only language beings. We are the composite of language, body, and emotions. So when we train our learners to speak a foreign language, we need to incorporate the three domains. And finally, this has showed excellent results in my classes, doing improvisation exercises like the ones we do in drama training, because an actor doing improv has to really listen attentively to what someone has said or done or acted on, and then the reaction he or she has is contingent on what the other person has done. So improvisation exercises impact positively on listening. So bottom line, my invitation is that we shift from this self-centered listening to this more genuine listening, where our undivided attention goes to the speaker. Remember that listening is an interpretation of what we make, not what we hear. So listening is no longer the result of, it's no longer the spontaneous result of conversation. We need to do something in the listening process. When the learner becomes aware of this, they realize that they are 100% responsible not only for their listening, but also for making sure about what the other person has understood from them. So finally, Listening is like our abracadabra. Do you know the meaning of abracadabra? The Aramaic was, I create as I speak. So with good listening, many, many new opportunities open up and are created. As the negotiation expert William Ury says, with the simple power of listening, we can transform absolutely everything, year by year. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for questions. If you have any questions. Yes. Good question. What I tend to do is early in the year, the first time that they do one of these circles, I do have them work with a script, or I have a script available for them. But as we go through these circles, and they've done a few of them, I try to have them, I try to find talks where there's no script available, because if there's a script available, it turns into a reading activity, basically. So I try to move them away from that, but it is good scaffolding at first. Other questions? I don't necessarily pre-teach words, but I will often do some sort of classroom activity around that listening text before they do the listening circles. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, and that's something that without the script, the student would have to listen to that, try to pass it out, write it down, and Google it with whatever spelling they can come up with. And very often when it comes to unknown words without the script, they find that they have to do a little bit of sleuthing to figure out what it is. Yeah. Yeah. So that is an issue. They just have to go with whatever spelling they can muster up. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yeah. Ah, yes. Well, that is a bit of an issue. It has happened, and I tend to link participation in these academic listening circles with their attendance and their homework. And you know, if you can't ding them somehow, certain number of absences, yeah. Right. In that case, you would have to try to move through the circle without that student. It depends on how many of them are absent. Now again, no class is always going to be divisible by 4 as well. So sometimes I have students double up roles and they work together. You might get 2 analyzers and they work together. Yeah. Another thing I do, just to preempt any other questions about this, is sometimes, especially at the beginning when I'm doing the first couple listening circles, is I'll have them do it as a jigsaw. So all the leaders in the class will get together before they do the listening circle and kind of compare notes, all the discourses, all the analyzers and so on, and then they move into their group. So they can just kind of double check a little bit with each other before they become the authority in their group. Yeah.
Not so much a question, actually. Just want to say thank you, because I really love the talk, and I love the materials that you have on the Google Drive link. Just for because I tried to type it in, and the last one is not an L but a capital I.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
if you want, because
FYI.
it's actually it's really useful documents, and I love them, and I will actually use them in my class as well. So thank you.
Okay.
That's all.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, thank you all very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.